Helios 522, do you read? Helios 522, do you read? Over the course of several attempts, Greek air traffic controllers endeavored to establish communication with the flight, but their efforts were met with silence. The aircraft arrived in Athens, where it was expected to initiate its descent. However, it did not do so. Instead, it entered a holding pattern, circling over the island of Charistos, approximately 65 kilometers southeast of Athens. With no communication from the aircraft and escalating concerns regarding the situation on board, the Greek military opted to intervene, suspecting a potential terrorism incident. At 11:23 a.m., as Flight 522 commenced its sixth loop in the holding pattern, two F-16 fighter jets finally approached the aircraft. One F-16 positioned itself behind the aircraft, prepared to engage if necessary, while the other approached for a closer inspection. What they observed next was beyond their worst fears. Join us as we explore the events surrounding Helios Airways Flight 522, which took off on the evening of August 13, 2005. A Boeing 737 operated by Helios Airways departed from London Heathrow, bound for Larnaca, a coastal city in southern Cyprus. The flight proceeded without incident until the cabin crew noticed an unusual noise, a loud banging emanating from the right aft service door. Upon further investigation, they discovered that the seal around the door had frozen, raising alarms about the integrity of the aircraft's pressurization system. After landing in Larnaca at 1:25 a.m., the flight crew recorded the issue in the aircraft's cabin defect log, indicating that the right aft service door required a thorough inspection. Additionally, the captain personally relayed the issue to ground personnel. Engineer Alan Irwin, a seasoned professional, performed a visual inspection and a pressurization leak test to detect any potential issues. To carry out the leak check while the aircraft remained on the ground, the pressurization system had to be manually activated. The pressurization system on a Boeing 737 is essential for ensuring a safe and comfortable cabin environment, as it simulates lower altitude conditions to provide adequate oxygen levels for passengers and crew during flight. This system functions automatically during flight, adjusting to changes in altitude. During ground tests and maintenance checks, the pressurization system was switched to manual mode, allowing Alan to directly manage the pressurization process. This enabled him to test for leaks and verify the integrity of the cabin pressure seals without the engines running. The inspection showed no defects, the pressurization system appeared to operate correctly, and no unusual noises were noted. Pleased with the findings, Alan concluded his inspection and authorized the aircraft for service. However, a significant detail was neglected: the pressurization mode selector was left in the manual position, which set the stage for unexpected complications. The following morning, on August 14, 2005, the same Boeing 737 was readied for its next flight. 2 pilots and 4 cabin crew members arrived to operate Flight 522 to Prague, with a scheduled stopover in Athens. The flight plan for that day involved flying northwest over the Mediterranean Sea toward the Greek mainland, with a descent into Athens planned. After departing from Athens, the aircraft would proceed northward, traversing southeastern Europe before ultimately arriving in Prague. At the helm was Captain Hans-Jürgen Merton, a 58-year-old seasoned pilot with extensive experience flying for various small airlines throughout Europe. He had amassed a commendable number of flight hours on the Boeing 737. Although his somewhat reserved demeanor occasionally clashed with Cypriot flight crews, there had been no significant complaints regarding his performance since he joined Helios Airways in early 2005. Assisting him that day was 51-year-old First Officer Pampos Carol Lambas, a Cypriot citizen who was also well versed in operating the Boeing 737 and had been with Helios Airways since its inception. As 115 passengers, primarily Cypriots and Greeks, boarded for the initial leg to Athens, the pilots commenced their pre-flight checks, which encompassed approximately 80 items, including 8 related to the pressurization panel. One critical item was the pressurization mode selector, which needed to be set to auto. Although the checks proceeded as expected, the crew overlooked the fact that the pressurization mode selector remained in the manual position, a setting used during maintenance checks the day before. After completing their pre-flight checks, the pilots advanced to the before-start checklist, confirming that all aircraft systems were appropriately configured for flight. Despite this meticulous process, the incorrect setting of the pressurization mode selector went unnoticed, representing a significant oversight with dire implications. With all checks finalized, the pilots initiated the engine start sequence. After departing from the gate and taxiing to the runway, the aircraft took off uneventfully, becoming airborne shortly after 9:00 a.m. It ascended towards 10,000 feet, with further clearances anticipated. For the next 5 minutes, the aircraft maintained a steady climb rate of approximately 2,500 feet per minute. The controller subsequently cleared Flight 522 to reach its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet, with cabin pressure equalizing with the external air pressure almost immediately. Unbeknownst to the passengers and crew, a significant issue was beginning to develop. Before delving deeper into this unfolding situation, I would like to express my gratitude to our sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most extensive vehicle combat game ever created, now available for free on PC and consoles. Players can command over 2,500 tanks and engage with helicopters and ships from 10 major nations, spanning from the 1920s to the present day. Experience intense combat with highly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound. Join over 70 million players globally in epic PvP battles and explore the vast, high-quality content that War Thunder provides. It is an excellent choice for enthusiasts of military history. What I particularly appreciate is the diverse range of vehicles available for control and the meticulous detail in each battle. You can play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox now by following the link in the pinned comment or video description. New and returning players who have not played in the last 6 months will also receive a substantial bonus pack, which includes premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor Decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of a premium account. This offer is limited, so please act quickly. At 9:12 a.m., as the aircraft ascended through 12,500 feet, the situation continued to develop. The air pressure within the cabin reached an altitude equivalent to 10,000 feet, which automatically activated the cabin altitude warning horn. Typically, the maximum cabin pressure is around 8,000 feet above sea level during flight, a measure designed to ensure passenger comfort and safety throughout the journey. The activation of the cabin altitude warning horn should have prompted the crew to cease their ascent, don their oxygen masks, and initiate a descent to a lower altitude. Regrettably, the crew misinterpreted this critical warning as a takeoff configuration alert on the Boeing 737. The sound of the takeoff configuration warning horn is identical to that of the cabin altitude warning, however, the former is only audible on the ground when the pilots advance the thrust levers without properly configuring the aircraft for flight. This misunderstanding led to confusion, and consequently, the essential procedure of donning oxygen masks and descending was not executed. Unaware of their error, the situation in the cockpit escalated. A few minutes later, both equipment cooling warning lights, marked with the word "off," illuminated, indicating insufficient airflow through the cooling fans due to reduced air density. The master caution light also activated, signaling that immediate attention was required. As the aircraft climbed through 16,000 feet, Captain Merton reached out to Helios Airways dispatch for assistance, explaining that a takeoff configuration warning horn was sounding and that there was a problem with the equipment cooling system. This issue exceeded the dispatcher's expertise, prompting him to involve Alan Earn, the same maintenance engineer who had previously conducted maintenance on the aircraft. During the pressure test, Merton informed IRN over the radio that both of his equipment cooling lights were off. Unfortunately, Merton's limited proficiency in English led to a misunderstanding. He likely intended to convey that both of his equipment cooling lights were on, but his message was misinterpreted. Confused by Merton's concern regarding a warning light being off, Wewin responded that this was normal and requested Merton to clarify the issue. However, the captain's reply was not particularly enlightening, stating simply that the lights were not switched off. As the conversation progressed, the cabin altitude exceeded 14,000 feet, resulting in the automatic deployment of passenger oxygen masks. An alert labeled Pass Oxy illuminated on the overhead panel, but the crew failed to notice it. Typically, this alert would activate the master caution light to attract attention, but since that light was already illuminated, it did not capture the pilot's focus. Unbeknownst to them, hypoxia, a silent threat, was gradually impairing their judgment. Hypoxia significantly affects cognitive and physical functions, which is particularly critical for pilots who must maintain high levels of alertness and decision-making skills. They could have promptly descended to a lower altitude where the air pressure would allow for normal breathing, ideally below 10,000 feet. However, they did not take this necessary action. While passengers and flight attendants began using their oxygen masks, the pilots remained preoccupied with the equipment cooling system, suspecting that Merton might have been referring to the green manual light on the pressurization panel nearby. Owen inquired whether he could verify that the pressurization mode selector was positioned to auto. However, the captain, already experiencing early signs of hypoxia, dismissed this inquiry and instead sought the location of his equipment cooling circuit breakers. As altitude increased, the adverse effects of diminishing blood oxygen levels became more pronounced. By the conclusion of the conversation with dispatch, Flight 522 was nearing an altitude of 29,000 feet above sea level, with the cabin altitude fluctuating between 24,000 and 26,000 feet. Mountaineers designate any altitude exceeding 26,000 feet as the death zone, where the human body is unable to absorb adequate oxygen, leading to a decline in both physical and mental capabilities, ultimately resulting in death. Tragically, Captain Merton and the first officer failed to don their oxygen masks and did not recognize that their aircraft was not pressurized. As the cabin altitude approached the death zone, Captain Merton rose from his seat to locate the circuit breakers but collapsed due to oxygen deprivation. Simultaneously, First Officer Carroll Ambus lost consciousness while still secured in his seat. Passengers and flight attendants who donned their oxygen masks managed to remain conscious for a short period longer. However, these masks provided only about 12 minutes of oxygen, predicated on the assumption that the pilots would initiate a descent to a lower altitude where normal breathing could resume. Instead, Flight 522 continued its ascent on autopilot, leveling off at approximately 34,000 feet. Between 9:30 and 9:40, air traffic control made multiple attempts to reach the aircraft but received no response. Helios Flight 522, under the control of its autopilot, adhered to its designated flight path as it entered Greek airspace. Despite repeated attempts by Greek air traffic controllers to establish communication with the aircraft, their efforts were met with silence. Upon reaching Athens, where a descent would typically commence, the aircraft failed to initiate this maneuver due to the autopilot's requirement for manual input. Consequently, it entered a holding pattern, circling over the island of K, located approximately 65 kilometers southeast of Athens. This holding pattern is a pre-established procedure that allows an aircraft to remain within a designated airspace while awaiting further directives from air traffic control. It generally involves flying in a circular trajectory, which helps conserve fuel and maintain a safe altitude while avoiding other air traffic. As concerns regarding the situation aboard the aircraft escalated, and with no communication established, the Greek military opted to take action, possibly suspecting a terrorist threat. At approximately 11 a.m., 2 F-16 fighter jets were dispatched from a nearby airbase to visually assess the passenger jet. The Boeing 737 continued to maintain its holding pattern, still under autopilot control. At 11:23 a.m., as Flight 522 commenced its sixth loop in the holding pattern, the two F-16s finally made contact with the aircraft. The pilots of the F-16s were likely unprepared for the unusual circumstances they were about to encounter, as the situation had already deviated significantly from standard protocols. However, the scenario was about to take an even more unexpected turn when one of the F-16s initiated a maneuver. The F-16 positioned itself behind the aircraft, prepared to engage, while another approached for a closer inspection. The pilot of the F-16 attempted to signal their presence to the crew of the 737, but there was no response. The crew inspected the exterior for any damage but found none. As one of the F-16s moved in closer, the pilot encountered a scene reminiscent of a horror film. The cabin lights were off, and oxygen masks dangled in the aisles, illuminated by sunlight streaming through the windows. Several passengers, wearing oxygen masks, were slumped against the windows, completely motionless. As the F-16 pilot maneuvered closer to the cockpit, he noticed an individual slumped in the first officer's seat, showing no signs of life, while the captain's seat remained vacant. Stunned by this revelation, the F-16 pilot understood that Flight 522 had transformed into a ghost flight, with its passengers and crew appearing either unconscious or deceased. For an additional 14 minutes, the 737 continued to circle, shadowed by the two F-16s, whose pilots seemed resigned to await the inevitable. Then, an astonishing event occurred. Someone entered the cockpit, their face obscured by a mask, with a bottle beside them. They took their place in the captain's seat and grasped the controls. At this juncture, Flight 522 was in its 10th holding pattern, and its fuel reserves were critically low. The unidentified pilot had little time to acclimate to the 737's cockpit, as the left engine flamed out less than a minute after their entry into the flight deck. With only one engine providing thrust, the aircraft sharply turned to the left before stabilizing. The aircraft was on a northwesterly trajectory, struggling to maintain an altitude of 34,000 feet with only one operational engine. It began to descend, and despite the pilot's attempts to regain control, he was unsuccessful. The fighter pilots, unable to capture his attention, had no choice but to withdraw to mitigate the risk of a mid-air collision. Within moments, the 737 flew over Euboea Island, descending rapidly. One of the F-16s approached closely and observed the first officer sitting upright, as if he had attempted to awaken him, yet he remained unresponsive. Shortly thereafter, the aircraft executed a sharp left turn, once again crossing over the island while descending towards 7,000 feet at a rate of several thousand feet per minute. Flight 522 was on the brink of catastrophe when its right engine also depleted its fuel supply and flamed out. At that critical moment, the pilot acknowledged the fighter for the first time, responding to a hand signal. The fighter pilot then gestured for the mystery pilot to follow him to the airport, but the man merely pointed downward, indicating that the aircraft was descending uncontrollably and that there was nothing he could do. As the aircraft crossed back onto the mainland of Greece, it made another sharp left turn, climbing towards the hills along the northeastern coast of Athens. Recognizing the impending crash, the F-16s veered away at the last possible moment. The pilot at the controls attempted to pull up just before impact, perhaps in a last-ditch effort to soften the landing, but his attempts were in vain. At 3:12 p.m., Helios Flight 522 struck the ground violently and erupted into flames. Mere seconds later, the F-16 pilots observed the aftermath. Helios Flight 522 tragically went down, resulting in the loss of all 121 individuals on board. Emergency services, including fire crews and ambulances, were promptly alerted and rushed to the crash site located on Grammatico Hill, approximately 35 kilometers northeast of Athens. The incident was attributed to a combination of errors and systemic failures. Mechanic Alan Irwin asserted that he had reset the pressurization mode selector to the automatic setting following maintenance. However, this claim was later proven false through a thorough investigation. Despite his denials, Irwin faced 121 counts of manslaughter, which profoundly affected his life, although he was ultimately acquitted. The damage to his reputation was irreparable. Initially, there was uncertainty regarding the cause, as the switch was found in a position beyond manual, suggesting it might have been forcibly moved during the impact. Nevertheless, data from the electronic pressure control system indicated that the outflow valve had been fully opened since takeoff, which prevented proper cabin pressurization. Furthermore, the data revealed that the last 74 flights recorded in the system had encountered significant leakage, corroborating crew reports of issues with the R2 door. Several opportunities to avert the disaster were overlooked. Routine pre-flight checks of the pressurization settings could have detected that the selector was set to manual rather than automatic. Additionally, after takeoff, the cabin altitude warning horn was activated, signaling a critical lack of cabin pressure, yet the pilots misinterpreted this warning. A warning for a different alarm was overlooked, leading to a failure in taking corrective measures. Consequently, the individuals gradually lost consciousness due to hypoxia and were unable to recover. Flight attendant Andreas, who possessed a private pilot's license, managed to access the cockpit later in the flight. However, despite his efforts, he could not avert the disaster due to his limited experience and the critical nature of the situation. By the time he entered the cockpit, the aircraft had already depleted its fuel reserves, making it impossible to prevent the crash. In their final report, investigators proposed several recommendations aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. A significant recommendation was for Boeing to revise the 737 maintenance manual to ensure that the pressurization mode selector is set back to auto following a pressurization test. Additionally, they suggested the installation of 2 extra warning lights in the cockpit, one for takeoff configuration and another for cabin altitude warnings.